Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ernie Regehr, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the sixth and the final session of this Arctic Security webinar series. Today's discussion will be a chance to recall and review some of the conclusions and recommendations that emerged from, or that we'd like to see come out of, the 5 earlier sessions. The discussion will be led by today's panelists, and I'm going to introduce them shortly. But before launching into all that, I want to remind you that this series is brought to you by 3 sponsors. The North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network undertakes research, convenes conferences and workshops, and supports the next generation of policy thinkers and analysts on core Arctic defense and security policy challenges. Jill Barclay, an ADSIN postgraduate fellow, is the rapporteur for this series. Dr. Shannon Nash is the network manager, and Dr. Whitney Lockenbauer is the network lead. And Whitney is also one of today's panelists. And all 3 of these have been very instrumental and key in organizing this series. The Canadian Pugwash Group, the second sponsor, is the Canadian affiliate of the Pugwash International Conferences on Science and World Affairs, recipient in 1995, excuse me, of the Nobel Prize, and as you know, owes its name and origins to the village of Pugwash, Nova Scotia, just off the Northumberland Strait. Paul Meyer, a former Canadian ambassador for disarmament, turned university professor, is chair of the Canadian Pugwash Group. And the Rideau Institute of Ottawa is our 3rd sponsor. Peggy Mason is its president, and Peggy is today's other panelist as well. The Rideau Institute engages in independent policy, relevant research and analysis, advocacy and social media engagement on the Canadian international security policies. These are the series sponsors, and on behalf of all of us, I thank them for bringing us this quite rich and set of analysis and discussion on vital issues of Arctic security. The entire series is recorded for public availability on the NADSIN website. A report of the proceedings will be published as an ongoing resource for public debate, as an education tool, and as a set of policy recommendations that emerge from these discussions. So with that, we're now ready to begin today's session, and let me introduce our panelists. They're not appearing for the first time in this series today, and they're both certainly well known to many of you, so my introductions will be fairly brief. You've already heard that Peggy Mason is the president of the Rideau Institute. She has also had a distinguished career in government and diplomacy, including serving as Canada's ambassador for disarmament from 1989 to 1995. Among many other things, she served on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament for 8 years. She is currently a very active and valued leader in a number of Canadian civil society organizations that address these issues. Whitney Lockenbauer is research chair in the study of the Canadian North and a professor in the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University in Ontario. He also serves as honorary lieutenant colonel of the 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, and as I mentioned earlier, is network lead of the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. He's written or co-written and edited or co-edited more than 50 books and more than 100 academic articles and book chapters. I'm not going to start listing his publications. Many of you, however, are very familiar with his prodigious output. I'll only add that the Arctic security community is itself very fortunate to be the beneficiary of all of that work and his leadership. And today we're all fortunate to have Peggy, Peggy and Whitney with us to guide us through our discussion. And I thank you both for agreeing to do this. We'll hear first from Peggy and then Whitney. And they've emphasized that they, excuse me, want this to be a participatory session. All of the topics explored in the series are on topic today, and all of you are encouraged to weigh in on the insights, conclusions, and recommendations that you've drawn from or contributed to the discussion. You can use the chat function to do this, but also feel free to ask for the floor and to speak directly to us on any of these issues. So Peggy, would you start us off?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ernie. And it's really a great pleasure to be here today at the tail end of what has just been a marvelous series of discussions. And I echo Ernie's point about really wanting this to be as participatory and active a dialogue as possible. I'd just like to make a few opening comments. I won't touch on, I mean, there was so much. I'm just going to touch on a few points. Andrea Charon, in her presentation, and she in fact titled it this way, "There is resurgent great power competition, but not yet in the Arctic." And Whitney talked to us about, avoiding either ors and pointing out, avoiding binaries and pointing out that there is both competition and cooperation in the Arctic. And we know that from the Canadian Defence Policy 2017, the view of the Government of Canada, there is no military threat to the Canadian Arctic per se. And to keep things that way, but also to go well beyond that and to build human security in the Arctic, we have heard different speakers talk about different aspects of what I see as a three-pronged approach. The first is building resilient Arctic states from the community level up. And, Canada has a huge amount to do here, and we heard about that in every one of the sessions. This is Ernie Regeer in his keynotes idea of stable states are secure states, and that in turn requires community resilience, and which again, in turn, requires sufficient resources and meaningful Northerner participation. So that's prong one. Prong two, diplomacy and arms control, the full gamut from high-level strategic talks down to military talks to build and reinforce strategic stability. And we have a new opportunity to do that with a new president. So building the broader strategic stability on which the Arctic also depends, all the way down to dialogues at the Arctic level. That is prong two. Prong three, a focus on continental defense to remove vulnerabilities to the extent possible and to do it in a way that is not destabilizing, that does not incentivize arms racing, that does not undermine deterrence, which is based on mutual vulnerability. And here there's agreement on Canada's role in NORAD modernization, an enhanced focus on a traditional area for us, domain awareness, intelligence, reconnaissance, North Warning System upgrades. I should admit, my father was in the Canadian military, and I grew up on some of those North Warning bases. Upgrades to the North Warning System using artificial intelligence and machine learning. So broad agreement on this niche role for Canada, which is very good news because there are so many Arctic priorities that require funding on critical areas of human security related, of course, first and foremost to climate change. And military spending on NORAD modernization is not funded by the 2017 defense policy. So very good news that there's agreement on an area, a niche area for Canada where we can keep the cost under control, hopefully. Now, on enhancing strategic stability, Ernie referenced the Biden-Putin agreement to explore in the telephone conversation that they had to explore strategic stability discussions on a range of arms control and emerging security issues. So that's not Arctic specific, but obviously that's very important for the overarching strategic stability. And obviously Canada must support that effort. But I also pressed Ernie for some other dialogue processes, more Arctic specific dialogue processes. Pressed him, this being his area, one of his many areas of expertise. And so just wanted to throw out some of the examples. And frankly, when one sees the areas where Russia used to be involved in these kinds of Arctic specific military to military type dialogues or related dialogues and are not now, you know, there's room for hope that we can get perhaps these things back on track. So the first is bring Russia back into the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, a forum that involves military, government, expert voices to promote greater regional understanding, dialogue, and cooperation in the Arctic region. And that also includes some non-Arctic states. And Russia was a member, but not since 2014. Second proposal, revive the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff. That included Russia, but has not met since 2013. And that could focus on promoting information sharing, transparency measures, and other cooperative measures to reduce the risk of military incidents miscalculation. The OSCE Vienna, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, OSCE Vienna document is also often cited as a guide to military relations that might be drawn on in the Arctic setting. And Andrea Sharon mentioned the idea of a military code of conduct, which seems to be gaining currency. Of course, it would require buy-in from all states with armed forces capable of operating in the Arctic. Proponents see it as defining acceptable military practices and promoting transparency with a view to reducing irresponsible military activity and brinksmanship while preserving a low-tension Arctic environment. And I would say, before turning very briefly to China, my last point, states, including Canada, can and should promote deepening cooperation with Russia in the Arctic. Their upcoming chairmanship of the Arctic Council offers an opportunity there, although of course Whitney did offer some caution and nuance again in how we approach that. But as I said, states can and should promote deepening cooperation with Russia in the Arctic without that signaling tacit toleration of Russia on Ukraine, Crimea. Frankly, states have to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time, to have the necessary dialogues to promote stability without signaling tolerance in any way for Russian behavior in the Ukraine or elsewhere. And I raise that Ukraine specifically because there is where Canada can actually signal a difference, a slight difference in approach. In addition to all that we're doing to support good governance in Ukraine and military readiness, we should also start including in our talking points support for the peace process, for the Normandy format, which grew out of the Minsk agreement for Ukraine, and which we studiously avoid making any reference to in our talking points. It's time we started raising that, and I note that there are many voices urging Biden to take up the Ukraine issue in this way. Now, my final point, I really was interested in the opening keynote and of course it was echoed by many different speakers and participants, this issue about how to handle China's soft power in the Arctic. In a short version of the question is, do we resist at all costs the long con, or do we welcome China into the Arctic to allow the kinds of investments that are needed? And to that, I would say, really, there are fundamental governance issues involved here. And I was involved in a conference process that looked at Chinese investment in Africa with some very key African speakers. And they said was that what they needed was expertise and support to negotiate good deals in their interest. So this brings us right back to the first point I made about community resilience and about giving Northern communities the resources and the expertise and the support and the listening so that we can strengthen their ability to take advantage of investment opportunities without negative aspects of exploitation. I think I'll stop there and really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Peggy. Whitney, over to you.
Well, thanks, Peggy. I think you covered a wonderful range of areas that we begin exploring through our discussions over the last 3 weeks. So I'm just going to build on a couple of the elements that you've raised and maybe filter it through that framework that several of us referred to of thinking about threats through the Arctic, or as Dr. Greaves mentioned, also threats from the Arctic. So how we weigh that when we look at Russia, for example, as potentially a source of threats to North America, maybe not the North American Arctic, but threats that may emanate from the Russian Arctic, be they submarines, be they cruise missiles, be they ballistic missiles, that may pass through Canadian aerospace, through Canadian territory to reach targets. Then thinking about those threats to the Arctic, and we had a session on climate change, which I'll come back to in just a moment, and how we conceptualize climate change and environmental change as both threats to the region, but also creating or exacerbating or amplifying threats within the region. And then that whole basket of threats potentially in the region, and our wonderful panel bringing Northern perspectives with Bridget Larocque and John Mitchell, I think brought to light a lot of those concerns at the local level. And what was very interesting is they expressed, I think, quite unequivocally that they are not hearing a lot of worries at the community level about the great power competition as the most urgent set of threats to their way of life. But it's other aspects, and we heard gendered perspectives, of course, Indigenous perspectives on that, and the idea of the centrality of the environment to this whole discussion of Arctic politics on the many different scales that we've been exploring. So for today, I'd really love to hear questions from all of you as participants, and not only questions, but also some of your ideas, if you're willing to share them, about where this might be taken in terms of policy. We have the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, which gives sort of the high level, big G Government of Canada perspective on what a lot of the issues are that are familiar to those of us who've been exploring Arctic issues for a long time. The big challenge, of course, is converting that unorganized, and I would argue unprioritized list of apparently equally urgent needs into something that's actionable. And then how do we bring those agenda items into meaningful dialogue with what we prioritize as requirements within the defense and security sphere? I really like in the Arctic Northern Policy Framework a broadening of language away from whole of government, which I would argue is still something that's not been achieved. Peggy, I see you nodding. You know, given your experience, I'm sure you've encountered that. It still remains with us today, right? It's difficult enough even within the federal family to get departments and agencies and stakeholders to speak with one another. But the need to actually broaden that out across governments and levels of government within Canada, given the way that we're constructed as a country, and then also broadening that out to whole of society. And I think real opportunities for engaging with non-governmental organizations and also with the private sector to leverage some of the capacity that exists in the North. And when I say that, I'm not only talking about disaster response or more human security responses as well, but we're talking about layered ecosystems of sensors and some of those constructs that Dr. Chiron and Dr. Teeple introduced us to, I think we also can think about what opportunities Canada can play and what roles we want to play within these emerging opportunities relating to North American defense and security more broadly defined. So again, thinking about climate change and really a lot of discussions touching on the human and social impacts and the centrality of the environmental sector to Arctic politics. And the way Dr. Greaves also connected that to these frames of Atlantification and pacification. I don't think he's intending it in terms of a more Pacific region, but it's the opposite. It's the fact that as Pacific or North Pacific political affairs begin to spill over into the region, that also may be a catalyst for spillover effects on regional stability. We might talk a bit about NATO and the re-emergence of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap as a framework for exploring the European or Eurasian Arctic as an entrance point into the North Atlantic and some of those classic Cold War frames that some of us may have shelved but are now pulling back out. I also think, as much as I agree with Peggy that the military assessments that there is no short-term immediate military threat to the Canadian Arctic does not mean that there are no threats by non-like-minded states to the Canadian Arctic. And here I think particularly about a discussion about below the threshold activities, things that we may have seen playing out in the Nordics, certainly in the Baltics, and certainly in Ukraine, and perhaps discussions about cyber. And I know on a number of occasions, Dr. Buckley has raised questions about cyber, and maybe today in our discussion, we'll explore some of the Arctic dimensions of cyber and where that tool might be used in a distinctively Arctic way. I would suggest its purpose would not be to destroy things as much as to potentially sow some chaos and divert attention and resources towards our Arctic. And then we might also talk a bit about information operations and how the potential for polarization of certain debates may also be ripe for exploitation. Or perhaps some of you will suggest that those debates are ones that are inevitable given some of the dilemmas that exist at the core of our economic models and development models for the Arctic, which in essence threaten to exploit the very resources that are the drivers of climate change and the drivers of some of the long-term human instability within the region. I'd also love for us to chat about community level and resilience issues. And I think, as I mentioned, Bridget brought up some of those questions about gendered impacts of security and priorities within Indigenous communities in the North. And then John Mitchell talked about the Canadian Rangers, talked about environmental change and what that's driving in terms of search and rescue and imperatives for emergency response and disaster response and humanitarian assistance within the region. As well, Dr. Causey talked about threats to built infrastructure and what future investments in infrastructure might look like, given environmental changes going on in the region. I also think he enticed us with some interesting reflections on new social networks emerging in the North and how we might conceptualize opportunities at the sub-regional level. So say within the Kitikmeot region of Nunavut, and what sort of relationships we might be looking for within those areas rather than everything connecting to Southern Canada. So I think this ties into perhaps interesting opportunities for Canadian Armed Forces to be at the forefront of innovation as it's determining what its increased northern footprint should look like. This, of course, being directed by Strong, Secure, Engaged, and also the Arctic Northern Policy Framework. And then lastly, one of the topics I'd love for some of the audience members to weigh in on is NORAD modernization. And this being the area where I think Canada needs to get moving in earnest. That we actually miss the opportunity to shape what kind of roles we would like to play within that construct unless we start to have some of those difficult decisions. And I think foremost among them will be questions about missile defense and whether or not the new deterrence by denial approach and the SHIELD construct perhaps encourages us to revisit our stance, at least over the last couple of decades, that's against our direct participation. And if so, what does our participation look like? What do these sensor systems look like if they're inherently contributing to a chain of systems or a layer of systems that are all going to be interacting, that are ultimately going to be feeding in to US analytics, determining how to respond, even preemptively, to strikes, depending on who we're listening to in terms of some of that discussion over SHIELD. So I think there's real opportunities to have some right and frank conversations about what NORAD modernization should look like. And I'm making a normative statement there. What should NORAD modernization look like from a Canadian participation standpoint? And who should be involved in that conversation? And then lastly, what opportunities might Canada stand to gain by being involved in that conversation early? And how do we get the decision makers within the civil service and the political elites to take note of some of these emerging challenges and think about proportionate Canadian contributions to them? Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Whitney. We're off to a terrific start. There is one question from Paul Meyer on the chat, and another question is coming up. But maybe I'll insert one just early on, because it was one of the early panels, and that is the Northern Perspective panels, and maybe Whitney, you want to particularly address that. And that there were specific comments about the importance of devolving a decision making into the North, and in the context, I think it was of the Arctic Security Working Group, point made that it's very important for all voices to be heard. The importance of Indigenous communities and rangers and others in sovereignty issues. So it's the broad question is: are there institutional gaps that need to be closed or filled in order to enhance the or to amplify the voices of the North in these decisions? So there's that, and Peggy, I wonder if you might look at Paul's question online and then respond to that.
Well, thanks, Ernie. It's a great question. Again, I want to be very clear. I'm not speaking on behalf of Northerners. This is Whitney Lochinbauer Calunat, Ontarian perspective on it. So I think there are gaps. But I also want to start with a caveat that when the consultations were held by the federal government that led to the Arctic Northern Policy Framework, the Department of National Defense was held up as one of the best examples of best practices for ongoing consultation and information exchange with Indigenous peoples with respect to activities in Indigenous homelands. So if we turn to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 30, and requirements that military activity should not take place on lands or territories unless justified by relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed upon with those Indigenous peoples. When I heard that read that reference in the Arctic Northern Policy Framework, I thought, good, so Canada is doing well. And Northern rights holders within the Indigenous peoples are acknowledging that. That said, we have thick informal networks that exist in which Northerners serving in the Canadian Rangers, for example, are not only the eyes and ears, but also the voice of their communities within the Canadian Armed Forces, that I think help to deal with our situational awareness of some of those threats in the North and potentially to the North. And I'm thinking more on the soft security side. I think where the gaps exist, Ernie, might be on the hard security side. And it's going to be very interesting to also have pretty open conversations about what conversations Northern Indigenous representatives want to be involved in. We're all well aware, I think, of some of the capacity issues that challenge a lot of Northern representative organizations, including the permanent participants to the Arctic Council. And it's often human capacity issues. So while individuals will have a great deal of subject matter expertise in certain areas, it's a very small number of people who are expected to comment on a very wide range of areas. I think one of the questions is, do Northerners want to be involved in conversations about how we're going to deal with those threats through the Arctic? So threats that are not actually pertaining to heightening risks to their homeland in a direct way. And if so, I think as part of the process leading up to NORAD modernization, there is an opportunity for the Department of National Defense and the Government of Canada to have those conversations. And the conversations perhaps not exclusively being big C consultations as legally mandated, but also conversations around these issues where there's also an opportunity for reciprocal learning and education to go on with Northerners. And I think it's a real opportunity as well to not allow this agenda to be set up as one of those binaries between investing in communities or investing in dedicated military infrastructure or capabilities, that in fact, the vision of the Government of Canada is to do both. And that's the responsible vision. So figuring out how everyone can benefit from a bigger pie will be beneficial, with the caveat, as Peggy said, that we don't want that pie to get too big and choke out our ability to have other pies in other parts of what governments are required to deliver.
Great, thanks. Peggy. You need to unmute. There we are.
Yes, I had to unmute. Yes, well, in answer to Paul's question, really, it goes back to the point I made about the dialogues. I really think, I mean, if I could do one thing, it would be to reinstitute the Arctic specific military to military dialogue processes that used to involve Russia and now do not. So that would be my point there. I'm going to take the liberty, though, of having of now being speaking. I really want to, and hopefully to really stimulate some discussion from more discussion from our participants. I want to join with Whitney. This may be the one area on which we disagree, and that's with respect to ballistic missile defense and Canada's role therein. I mean, even the wildest proponents of the ground-based ballistic missile defense system in the US will only assert that it can work against a small number of missiles from a rogue state. And translating that into the Arctic, into the context of Russia and China, even if we say it's going to be conventionally focused on, I mean, that Russia's not going to look at it that way, nor should they. It's a denial. SHIELD is tantamount to a denial of nuclear deterrence. It's essentially saying that we will no longer have mutually assured destruction, that we will if it worked, it would put at risk the retaliatory capability of Russia and China, which is the basis of nuclear deterrence. So, but I take heart, because what I heard from Andrea Shaw in particular was it's completely unfunded. It was unfunded even under Trump. They didn't get it funded yet. And Biden, I would suggest, and she talked about the priorities he's got, and we're all familiar with them. Certainly, we're familiar with the climate priority and the money post-COVID rebuilding and all of that. And this kind of system, the SHIELD system we're talking about, is extraordinarily expensive, and it would be on top of huge increases in nuclear modernization increases that are already planned, which I think President Biden will also be interested in curtailing somewhat, although that is a difficult task, as President Obama found out. This is a massively powerful series of vested interests when you take on the nuclear weapons infrastructure in the United States. But so I guess I would suggest that we haven't missed the boat with respect to shaping the architecture, because it's a bit more open than perhaps we might have thought. And also that I think there's more than enough for us to do with respect to focusing on the enhanced domain awareness aspect. So I've been involved in these discussions at the government level on ballistic missile defense and Canada joining, and I'd also suggest that Canada should run in the other direction rather than getting involved in the political dimension of that, which is quite difficult. But anyway, I hope this gets people going.
Wonderful. I actually, Peggy, agree with a lot of what you've said, with some caveats. First of all, I'm not sure that SHIELD necessarily is designed or conceptualized to deal with a massive nuclear exchange. It's more scenarios in which an adversary could seek to deliver a targeted, say, the way General O'Shaughnessy would talk about it, a limited conventional strike at North America to disrupt our ability to mobilize and deal with things in other parts of the world. But I would refer off to a piece that Ryan Dean and I wrote for NADSIN, A Quick Impact, thinking about deterrence logic. And I would also refer everybody to Ernie Regeer's wonderful book, where he deals with some of these questions right on. And I think that's exactly the sort of conversation, Peggy, that you're inviting, that I think would be healthy, is as Canadians to say, what does this look like? If it is truly a challenge, and it is about complete denial, if this is SDI Star Wars 2.0 in its aspirations, that's going to require a fundamental rethink of how we conceptualize deterrence. On the other hand, enhanced capability for deterrence by denial, I would say in theory, could actually enhance the credibility of deterrence writ large. And it will also depend upon which domains we're thinking about. So where I'd agree with you violently, Peggy, is we need to have discussions about this. These are core issues. These are things that Canada's been grappling with for a long time. Yet I think we've forgotten how to have these conversations in some respects, and it'd be helpful to do so.
Great, thanks. We may come back to this topic again, but there are a couple of other questions. One is from Richard Denton, and he talks about, he asks about a deep water port in the north, and then makes the comment that we're spending large sums of money on the Navy new vessels, but will any of these play a role in the Arctic ice harden? And would this money not be better spent on icebreakers and search and rescue? So if you have comments on the sort of the utility of the new Arctic patrol vessels and the slowness of acquiring another large icebreaker, maybe that. And you might also add to that Adele's question, which is more of a straightforward information one, I think. Is Canada an equal partner in NORAD now or in future modernization? And I don't know whether Adele means by that equal funding partner as well, but that's implied. So you want to start us off, Peggy, on those two, and then Whitney?
Boy, well, I mean, an equal partner, I guess it all depends on what you mean by equal partner. I mean, we have our specific areas of responsibility. And I would say, within those areas, we have, Canada's sovereign in them. But if we want to go back, and I will go back to the issue, for example, of ballistic missile defense. And this was one of the reasons why it became so politically toxic when Paul Martin was considering it, was because the aim, of course, is to shoot down the missile in space before it gets over your airspace. And that means that when it's being shot down, United States would not know, whether it was going to hit United States or Canada, the Canadian Arctic, or hit the mainland of United States. And that means that the decision to shoot it down is a vital national security decision that cannot be devolved. So it means that even if Canada participated fully in missile defense, which I frankly don't think we're going to do, but if we did, we still would not have equal decision-making power. We would be sitting at the table, but the decision would be made by United States because they can't, in fact, devolve the decision. So in that specific area, that's an example where we're not an equal partner based on capacities, who has the bulk of the missile defense capacity, as opposed to Canada participating in some way. But having said all that, and I'm sure Whitney will elaborate on this, Canada has a lot to say, and it's a very unique relationship, the partnership for North American aerospace defense. So that was the first one. With respect to the sums of money on the vessels, I mean, my concern about the Arctic, I've forgotten the exact name, offshore patrol frigates, was that they weren't ice capable enough. I mean, the classic problem of Canada trying to do many things with these big projects, and there being some concern that perhaps we'd spread ourselves too thin, and therefore they wouldn't be able to play the role in the Arctic that we need. I suspect the ships that are being discussed are the surface combatants, the new surface combatants, which are, and not the Arctic patrol frigates, which are have specific relevance to the North. But again, I'd have to say, it's not an either or, that we have to try, we have to prioritize, but we really have to find money for some of these capabilities that are so desperately needed in the Arctic.
So I'll take a cut at a couple of those. First of all, I'd say with NORAD, maybe it's not a completely equal partnership, but it's very equitable. And given the equities that Canada brings to the table in a binational command, when you look at the asymmetries according to every metric of power between Canada and the US, we're the envy of the world of any modest sized non-great power having the relationship that we have. So my suggestion is we are very well suited. We have that seat at the console. We have a seat in decision making within NORAD. And there are expectations that we are going to ante up. Sometimes I do the pithy equation of when the DEW line was constructed, the Americans paid for the whole thing. We eventually picked up some of the O&M costs after it was operational and resupply costs and so on. But then we came around to the 1980s, and Ernie, you can correct me if my math is off, but at the very best Canadian sort of scenario, Canada paid for 40% of the construction costs relating to building the North Warning System or upgrading the DEW line to the North Warning System. The US still kicked in 60%. If I'm looking at that trend line, it wouldn't have been surprising to me under the Trump administration if at the very least they insisted that we pick up 60% of the costs for whatever was going to be going on in terms of sensor systems in Canadian territory this time. But knowing Trump, he would have probably tried to negotiate and have us pay 100% of the costs to say we're jumping, ahead to reciprocate and for what the DEW line cost the US. So I think going forward, it is our time to not be excessively parsimonious and try to look like we're free riding on this one. We have responsibilities under NORAD. NORAD benefits us. And the Arctic is probably an aspect of contributions to NORAD where we are very well suited to play. And we have a chance to make really meaningful contributions that will be respected. In terms of questions, first of all, for the Harry DeWolf class Arctic and offshore patrol vessel, I think they give us a lot of capability that we didn't have before. I think the fact that they have relatively modest armament and can only break ice up to 1 meter are not things that concern me, given the threat environment that we're looking at and the amount of capacity that these bring for humanitarian disaster response capabilities. These are great to have. And it's telling that the Coast Guard is also procuring some of them after the Navy gets its piece. And again, does that negate the need to build icebreakers? No, we have our interim measure with the ones that we've purchased for the next few years, but we need to get going on the Diefenbaker and figure out what our needs are going beyond that. So recapitalization is important. There's a much bigger question that we may play with in terms of infrastructure needs in the north. And when we throw out declarations of requirement for things like ports, I would say, sure, that's a good idea. We're building a deep water port in Iqaluit. I'm not sure if that was the place that I would have necessarily said was the ideal spot, but for people who actually make decisions, obviously arrived at it based upon their criteria. Is that sufficient? Depends on what futures we're trying to carve out. If we're looking at augmenting our ability to operate with deep draft vessels in the Arctic, or to stimulate non-renewable resource-based economic development in certain areas, then it probably makes sense for us to look at ports. I think this is something where it makes sense and behooves us to think about it in terms of multimodal systems, to think about dual use benefits of those infrastructure investments, and then also have conversations with our American and Greenlandic/Kingdom of Denmark allies to figure out where those infrastructure investments, if we're thinking about them through a defense and security lens, where those investments are made optimally in a truly North American construct. And I think this is one of the areas as well that if we're thinking holistically about what North American defense and security modernization looks like, we need to be really opening up our aperture and looking much more broadly at all the secondary and tertiary benefits, but also risks that these kind of investments entail, and also have some pretty frank discussions about what the relative short, medium, long-term returns on investments are for some of these massive infrastructure projects versus investing in improved wharves and small craft harbors at community levels, which can enable localized search and rescue and food sovereignty and so on.
Great, thank you. Peggy.
Thank you very much. I just want to come back in on the cost aspect because, and that's why, of course, the Canadian surface combatants are in the news because of increasing costs. But I do think we have to face that elephant in the room that I mentioned in the opening that the 2017 defense policy did not include, even though the very significant increase in defense spending did not include NORAD modernization. The big increases set out in the 2017 defense policy don't actually kick in until 2021. So that means, the government's already facing all of these other fiscal challenges. The feeling is that NORAD modernization would, DND would be told to find the money, which means setting different priorities. Now, on the plus side, I would say that DND, for the last 10 years, they haven't spent their annual allocation. And since the 2017 budget, they haven't spent to the tune of about $2 billion a year. And under the new accounting procedure set out in the 2017 defense policy, which was a very good change, the money doesn't lapse. It just gets added back in to the budget. So that part of it is the good news, that there's perhaps a little more wiggle room than there would have been otherwise. And of course, the reason why the money's not being spent is because the procurement programs are just so difficult to manage. It's not that the money's not allocated, it's that they're not able, the programs are behind. But nonetheless, it does provide some room to maneuver. But I do think that we have to be very, we have to be very clear-minded about the fact that there are a lot of calls on government spending going forward. And I would add, of course, that means that the North should get its fair share of that. But nonetheless, there are many calls on that money.
Great, thanks, Peggy. Now there's another question, comment related to NORAD modernization, but I think before going to that, if you don't mind, there's one on that's more climate oriented, and that we might do well to get into that, and that is from Bill Adams, and he asks: Is Russian long-term economic dependence on Arctic fossil fuel development going to conflict with US and other world powers' priorities for responding to climate change by reducing and eliminating fossil fuel use. So comments on the kind of the long-term viability and future of the Russian Arctic.
Well, thanks, Mr. Adams. I think this is exactly the sort of long-term strategic questions that we should be grappling with. So again, even when we're assessing the nature of threats and who we're seeing as threats and the basis upon which they can mount a threat. I mean, I look at Russia's vulnerability and fragility of its economy in terms of its lack of diversification. And if it is continuing to chart futures that are predicated on a tremendous global demand for oil and gas, and if that's something that the world decides that it's going to wean itself off of, what does that mean in terms of Russian behavior? Does it have to act boldly in the short term while it can still afford to be a bold player? Or does this mean that over time it's going to start to make the necessary structural adjustments, recognizing that that global demand equation is going to change? If I read it correctly, read a news piece today talking about Russia looking at potentially building plastics factories in its Arctic. And I would see that as potentially a way of Russia saying, how can we remain a player going forward if the oil and gas, and particularly the oil, is not going to be used primarily as an energy source, but as something that's going to be fashioned into plastic products? You know, maybe this is the kind of changes, structural changes that we might anticipate from Russia going forward, or we might see the opposite logic of drill, baby, drill. We want to open up the taps as wide as we can while there's still the demand for it, enrich our coffers. And then does that potentially bring Russia into, as I think you're suggesting, loggerheads with the West, if the West does choose that we're going to get serious on mitigation of climate change? It's a wonderful big question with, I think, a lot of strategic implications, not only related to the defense realm, and not only related to the Arctic, but more broadly.
Peggy, do you have anything to add on that? There's a few more questions that we want to get to. No, yeah,
no, I don't.
Okay, great, thanks. The Ed, I'll just take them in order. Edward Kaufman asks whether there would be difficulties in establishing an Arctic code with respect to any redundancy with UNCLOS or the Arctic Council. Either of you can shed some light on that question?
So I guess I might ask for a little bit more clarity, Ed, in terms of the Arctic Code, if this is sort of a code of conduct in terms of military behavior, in which case I would say, as long as it's in compliance with UNCLOS and no one is taking away from the sovereignty or sovereign rights of the different Arctic states sitting around the table, I'd say no. And I mean, I'm a big fan of the Arctic Council not having a military security mandate. I think that's what saved the Arctic Council. I think, ironically, it's the United States and Russia opposing what I think in the 1990s were very well-intentioned appeals to want to have it solidify or sediment some kind of a nuclear weapons-free zone or arms control regime within it. I think what's allowed it to thrive into the 21st century has particularly removing that level of high politics that I think particularly since 2014 would have probably sunk the Arctic Council, or at least very much stressed it in its ability to function within some sort of a business as usual, as I think it has largely succeeded in doing. So in terms of the Arctic Code of Conduct, I think I would not turn to the Arctic Council as the institutional mechanism to manage that. I don't think that serves the Arctic Council's purpose. I don't think that serves the Arctic states' purposes. I think instead, looking at perhaps some of those mechanisms that did exist, like the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, is something I'm sure that is being considered. I think Peggy set up what I think is still that wicked question, the wicked challenge of, but how do you do that without it looking like you're handing Russia a new status quo, business as usual after their revisionist activities in Ukraine and elsewhere? So I'll leave it there.
I'll just jump in too. Yes, of course, as Whitney surmised, it's a military code of conduct, and therefore should be outside the Arctic Council. And I just would add and of course it would need to be in conformity, but there wouldn't really be any basis for it not to be in conformity with UNCLOS, I wouldn't think. But in terms of the hard question, how do you get back to the talks and reestablish these mechanisms without appearing to be saying to Russia, let bygones be bygones. I think what needs to be happening, and I mentioned this at the outset, President Biden is being urged very strongly to get involved in supporting the peace process with respect to the Donbass, based on the Minsk agreement principles, which start from the premise of Ukraine territorial integrity and sovereignty. So everyone would, that's the starting point. And I think that even a signal from the United States that they were interested in doing this would make it immeasurably easier for everyone else to take these other steps. On the other hand, the others speaking up and saying they want to take these steps, provided that there is a reinvigoration of the Minsk process in the Normandy format, would actually help get those, get that launch. So it's kind of a chicken and egg. So let's try and do both.
Maybe I'll just comment briefly, Whitney, on that, the business of giving Russia a free ride. I mean, I think it depends a lot on how these forums are structured. If they're structured as the Arctic Council is, for example, in that, I mean, participation is not a reward for good behavior. It's you participate in it by virtue of being a member, and membership doesn't go away in the event of bad behavior, just like so there are many international fora. The OSCE, the Vienna document of the OSCE continues regardless of the nature of the behavior, and becomes a forum for addressing that behavior. So I think if these Arctic dialogue forums were structured as being that you're there by virtue of your geography, that's where you happen to be, and then and so it continues. I mean, the problem with the NATO NORAD or with the NATO Russia Council is that it tends to get suspended when it's most needed to address these things. So I think that there are ways around the notion of reward for continuing to participate. I'm just now going back to the questions on the chat, and we're at 4 o'clock, but we can continue on for a few minutes, and that is an issue put there by, and you've probably seen it on the threat, the threat to North America. Do you think the U.S. and Canadian government can come to common ground on the categorization of the threat? Who do you think is most likely to compromise? Will the government of Canada take a harder stance? Will the U.S. soften its stance under President Biden? And here's the key. If they can't, what does the future of NORAD modernization look like if you can't agree on the fundamental threat? So that's a big one for you both to weigh in.
I always prefer posing questions like that rather than answering them. No, I think you framed it really, really well. And I think Canada will, have to come to some sort of a common ground with the United States. And I think this has been our dilemma since the Second World War. At the end of the day, if the United States is unwilling to compromise on it, we'll have to carve out what niches we want to play within that strategic threat environment that the United States is responding to. So in essence, I do think that President Biden may reconsider within an Arctic context, if I'm holding that, focusing on that variable, may return to more of the messaging under Obama, which I think left more space for a focus on soft security issues, and in particular, human security and environmental security type issues. I don't think that requires a complete pivot away from what the US national security strategy is identified as being the two main competitors, China and Russia, and that will feed the US system in terms of focusing on what threats they represent within the Arctic. What I hope, and this is me introducing my own bias directly into this, what I hope they will do is take a careful look and figure out where, in what domains and in what areas Russia represents a threat within the Arctic and where China represents a threat in the Arctic. I think China, for example, in the medium term at least, is a much more significant risk in terms of foreign direct investment and influence activities in the region than it is a military threat in any direct sort of way. On the flip side, the opportunities for potentially cooperating for Russia are amplifying the relationships that already exist between US Coast Guard District 17 and their Russian counterparts just across the Bering Strait are very healthy. They're in communication every single day from what US Coast Guard District 17 says. That can be something that can be amplified to say, yes, we are competitors globally. We are in competition. On the other hand, within an Arctic space, that can be balanced off with meaningful dialogue and cooperation where it's in our joint interests. So in order to set up Russia and China as major threats and to get the funding envelopes necessary to respond to those threats, I don't think the US has to go and make them a threat everywhere in all scenarios at all times. And I was worried that over the last couple of years, that was the direction that we were heading. I hope that's checked because I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it leads to good strategic analysis. I don't think it leads to good diplomatic opportunities or space for positive diplomacy where it's appropriate, and it limits the range of options. So if that's what we mean by Canada potentially encouraging the US to potentially come around to what I think Strong Secure Engaged does, which is talks about deterrence and dialogue, where it means that we will be prepared to defend if needed and certainly deter wherever we can. But at the same time, there are going to be opportunities for collaboration where that serves mutual interests. And there are lots of mutual interests within the Arctic. And if we can keep those Arctic focused interests insulated from other parts of the world where we may not have common ground, that doesn't require us completely marching to the drummer of Arctic exceptionalism, which you can read a recent chapter Ryan Dean and I wrote, which expresses some skepticism about that concept. But it can recognize, no, for actual discrete variables, careful analytics will say there is some common ground in the Arctic that we need to leave space to be able to collaborate on where possible.
Peggy?
I think the only thing I would add to that, it would be that, I think there's clearly sufficient common ground now with President Biden, and for Canada to focus on, upping its game in our traditional area of enhanced domain awareness. I think that's what we're going to focus on, and I frankly think that that'll be, that President Biden will be happy, that the United States will be happy with that. So I think we don't have to have the exact same characterization of the threat in order to agree on the role that Canada, on a very useful role that Canada can play, whichever version of the threat you are espousing. But happily, I think the difference has narrowed between the two countries in terms of the characterization of that threat.
Thanks very much. Well, I think we've gone through all of the questions and points, and there have been some additional discussion on the chat function. Whitney and Peggy, are there any concluding comments that you'd like to make?
Well, I guess a couple of points. Of course, I've read some of what Whitney has referenced, but I must admit I haven't read everything that he's referenced, and so I have to go back and read it. I guess the problem that both Ernie and I have, and it's got to do with our age in part, with defense, is that, you know, we started learning all this stuff when Paul Nitze, you know, the negotiator of SALT I arms control agreement, was dealing with the Strategic Defense Initiative, but he made comments and conditions about defense versus offense more generally, and he set up the criteria that, you know, which is more cost effective at the margins. And frankly, it's an impossibility for defense to be more cost effective at the margins. And it sets up incentives for overwhelming those defenses, however precise, however limited, with more offensive systems. So it's an incentive for arms racing that we really have to try and avoid. So, I wanted to make that point, but I want to end with the point about Northern voices and Northern participation. For me, one of the most telling exchanges was a question that was asked to Bridget about how did she feel about the conversation about the threats emanating to the North American Arctic from some of the Arctic actors. And Russia and China were mentioned. And in her answer, she said that she wasn't willing to accept assertions by others of motivations when she had or there had been no meaningful opportunity for dialogue. And then she went on to say that she hoped that Canada would bring to bear, and she used the term peacekeeping, but I think she was talking broadly about diplomacy, would bring that to bear. And for me was one of the most telling moments in all of many good discussions during this series. And so I would like to end with that.
Thanks very much, Whitney. Just before going to you on just one more brief comment on ballistic missile defense and Canada's involvement. We need to keep in mind that a major item on the Biden agenda is going to be the follow-on to the New START treaty, which they've just extended. So that's going to be a preoccupation throughout, and ballistic missile defense has up to this point been really carved out of the great power competition, and in the sense that it's not directed at either Chinese or Russian second strike capability, and any moves that tend to compromise that position or will complicate the negotiations on a follow-on treaty very, very much. So that's a very important consideration for Canada to have when it thinks about that in the future. But Whitney, your concluding comments.
My concluding comments are going to be a thank you. So thank you to all of you as participants for bringing such wonderful insights into a conversation in what's obviously a constrained environment using Zoom, but thanks for enriching the conversations and directing the conversations with your questions. Thanks to all of the presenters on all of the panels over the last 3 weeks for bringing a diverse array of subject matter expertise to this conversation. And if anything, I come away very hopeful that we've at least started to set the table around which we can hopefully have these conversations in the months to come, and highlight as well, I'd like to highlight as well the importance and timeliness of these conversations. That even in our exchanges over the last hour, I think we've grappled with a lot of core questions that we're going to see playing out in the newspapers in the months to come, and that we benefit by exchanging views, and particularly exchanging views with those who don't share the same perspectives or assumptions that we do. That I think we have a great opportunity in this country to actually model how you can continue to have very civil, constructive discussions and debates, and even sometimes disagreements, because we are all looking for desirable futures. And we may come with different ideas about how we get there or what's realistic and what's possible, but we need to just embrace the wonderful opportunities we have in Canada to have these conversations. So thanks to all of you for the gift of your ideas, for the gift of your time. Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, Ernie, for all that you've done to help to make this series possible. And again, thanks to everyone for participating.
Well, thank you, Whitney. That was very well said. On behalf of us all, to thank all of the participants, to thank, as you've done, all of the panelists, to thank the organizers. Whitney and Shannon in particular have really done a lot of key work on putting this all together. Much appreciated. It's been a great few weeks to have the opportunity to address these issues with people of extraordinary expertise and knowledge on the Arctic, and so it's a huge privilege. Keep watching the NADSN website for the report on this series. So with that, thank you to all.